My name is Dolores Whitaker, and I was on my way to the airport. I was flying to Portland to spend the holidays at my sister's lake house. My bag was checked. The boarding pass was a crisp rectangle in my hand. But as I pulled into the long-term parking lot, a thought, small and sharp as a pinprick, stopped me. The will. Arthur's will. The original, not the copy I kept in the desk drawer. I turned the car around, figuring it would be a 5-minute errand, in and out. But what I walked into was something no mother should ever have to hear. Not in her own home. Not from her only son. The front door gave a soft groan as I pushed it open. I didn't call out. The air inside was still, too still. The weight of the keys was heavy in my palm, but I didn't drop them into the ceramic bowl on the hall table as I always did. Something in my chest, a small, warm pilot light I hadn't even known was there, quieted. I moved down the hall, my soft-soled shoes whispering against the hardwood floors. Voices drifted from the study, low, measured, careful. I paused behind the archway, my back flat against the wall, my breath held in my throat. If she shows signs, we can make the case. A voice said, one I knew as well as my own heartbeat. Grant, she's 74, another replied. With the right documentation, proving diminished capacity isn't difficult, Ashby. The name. The lawyer Grant had brought over after Arthur died, under the guise of helping to get Dad's affairs in order. My heart began to beat, a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I couldn't see them, but I could feel the shape of their conversation. They were talking about a conservatorship. About me. Grant continued, his voice devoid of emotion, as if discussing a business merger. I've already started a list. She misplaces things, repeats stories. She barely touched her taxes last year. I wanted to step forward, to scream his name, but instead I drew back, careful not to let a floorboard betray me. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm, but everything inside me had turned to ice. I walked back to my car and sat there, staring blankly through the windshield, the keys still clutched in my hand. The woman who had raised him, who had worked night shifts in the university archives so he could go to college without a single loan, was now being cataloged, itemized like a file in a court case. I pressed my lips together, not in anger, but in a kind of profound, seismic disbelief. It was in that moment that something inside me shifted. It didn't break, not yet. But the warmth in my chest, what was left of it, began to cool. And do you know the hardest part? It wasn't what I heard. It was realizing how long I had been ignoring what I already knew. If you have ever watched your own child turn into a stranger in your own house, you will know what I mean. This was the day I stopped being a mother first and started becoming something else entirely. Let me take you there. I did not go back to the airport. I did not call my sister. I just kept driving. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was adrift. I bypassed the on-ramp to the highway and let a deeper instinct guide me through old city streets I hadn't seen in decades. When I finally stopped, I was parked in front of a small bakery, sandwiched between a laundromat and a faded barbershop. The awning was new, but the smell wafting through the open door was the same. Cinnamon, butter, toasted almonds. This was the place Arthur had brought me every Sunday, rain or shine, back when we lived in a 2-bedroom flat on Union Street, when Grant was still a boy with scuffed knees and a head full of inventions. I went inside. The counter had been replaced with something sleek and polished, but the mismatched tables were the same, each holding a small vase with a single flower. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window. My fingers curled around the ceramic mug, seeking its warmth, something to anchor me. My eyes drifted to the sidewalk. People passed in heavy coats, their heads bowed against a wind I couldn't feel, their movements brisk. I remembered Arthur reading the paper at this very table while Grant stacked sugar packets into elaborate towers. He used to ask questions about everything: how bridges stayed up, how trains worked, how elevators moved. He didn't want simple answers. He wanted the blueprints. And I gave them to him. I brought books home from the library and circled passages in pencil. I signed him up for robotics camp before he even asked. He was curious then, not entitled. At least, that's how I remembered it. Somewhere between that boy and the man I'd overheard this morning, something had curdled. It hadn't happened overnight. It was more like a pot of water left on a stove. The steam begins quietly, then hisses, until the room is full of it. I remembered him insisting on handling Arthur's estate, telling me it was too much for me. I remembered him replacing our family accountant with a firm I'd never heard of, him setting up automatic payments for my property taxes without asking. I had seen the signs, but I had interpreted them as care. I had given him the benefit of the doubt, a tired mother's doubt, a grieving widow's hope. Now, all those small acts rearranged themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces that had been forced into the wrong places. Suddenly, the picture was starkly, terrifyingly clear. I left the bakery after drinking half the coffee. The bitter taste that lingered on my tongue wasn't from the brew, but from memory. Outside, the sky had softened to a uniform gray. I zipped my jacket to my chin and stood for a moment, just breathing. I wasn't ready to go home. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to remember who I had been before I started letting other people define me. And this quiet detour, this journey into my own past, was the beginning. The parking lot behind the public library was mostly empty when I arrived. It was late afternoon, and the sky had settled into the gentle, bruised gray of early winter. I pulled into the same spot I used to favor when I worked there, a muscle memory, a ghost of a habit. I sat for a moment, watching the bare branches of the great oak near the back entrance sway gently in the wind. Inside, it was quieter than I remembered. The carpets had been replaced and the checkout stations upgraded to sleek, self-serve kiosks, but the smell was the same. Ink, dust, and old wood, a scent that had always made me feel calm, capable, and whole. I walked past the fiction stacks and into the back, toward the archives. It hadn't changed much. The same tall, metal filing cabinets, the same beige fluorescent lights that flickered if you looked at them too long. I gave a nod to the young woman at the desk and asked if I could review a document I'd once cataloged, a copy of my late husband's will. She didn't question me, just slid a clipboard forward and pointed me toward a corner table. I found the file without trouble. My hand still knew where to look. The folder was thick, not because of the will itself, but because of Arthur's notes. He annotated everything, margins filled with arrows, dates, and abbreviations in his neat, compact script. It had made sense to him, and over the years, it had come to make sense to me. I spread the pages out carefully, my fingers tracing the lines of text. The will was intact. Nothing was crossed out, but it was the loose pages he'd left tucked inside the folder that held my attention. One note, on a piece of yellow legal paper, read, "Dolores, if you ever feel unsure, the answer is always in the numbers." I flipped to the last page of his notes. There was a chart, a breakdown of assets, property, investments, bonds. Next to each item was a note, to be held by D or granted to a qualifying trust, retaining legal stewardship until independent review. Not granted to grant for management. Not full access to our son. Arthur had been precise. He had trusted me. A warmth bloomed in my chest. Not anger, but recognition. Memory. The feeling of finally coming back to myself. I took a small notebook from my purse and began to make a list. First, make copies of everything. Second, consult legal counsel, someone not connected to Grant. Third, request an audit of any recent changes to my accounts. I underlined each item with a slow, steady pressure. When I walked out of the library, the sun had already dipped below the rooftops. The sky was a deep, calming twilight blue. The cold air didn't bother me. I walked to my car with a clear sense of purpose, my breath fogging in the air before me. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel like a person to be managed. I felt like Dolores Whitaker, the woman who once organized rare collections, who could recite acquisition policies from memory, who had once found a lost Revolutionary War letter behind a faulty filing cabinet, and who was now going to find her own. Way back, one document at a time. That morning, I moved slowly through my own home, not because my body ached, but because I needed the illusion to be real. I tucked a small digital recorder into the lining of my cardigan pocket. It was the one I used to use for oral history interviews at the library, no bigger than my thumb, with a soft click to begin recording. I made sure the tiny red light blinked once, then disappeared into the wool. I left the front door unlocked. The sun was just high enough to cast long shadows across the kitchen floor. I kept the overhead lights off, letting the natural light do its quiet work. I made tea, spilling a little on the counter and leaving the canister slightly ajar. Small, untidy acts, the kind that could be mistaken for forgetfulness. Grant arrived at 10:30. I had not asked him to come. He rarely called before appearing these days. He came in carrying a bag of groceries and that careful smile, the one he used when he wanted something. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my bathrobe, a half-finished crossword puzzle before me, a pen lying uncapped beside it. I looked up slowly. He kissed my cheek and remarked that the house was cold. I nodded, saying I must have forgotten to turn up the thermostat again. He set the bag down and took out a carton of soup, a loaf of bread, and a box of biscuits. The performance began. He asked how I had slept. I said I wasn't sure, then changed the subject mid-sentence. I let my hand fumble with the spoon. When he offered to heat the soup, I smiled and said, yes, as if he were doing me a great favor. Grant moved around the kitchen like someone taking inventory. His eyes scanned the calendar on the wall, the pill organizer by the sink, the stack of unopened mail. He commented on a letter from the insurance company. I said I hadn't gotten around to it. He offered to look it over for me. I pretended not to hear. After our small lunch, he leaned against the doorframe and watched me for a long moment. Then he said the thing that confirmed everything I already knew. He told me he'd been looking into assisted living communities, just options, he clarified, places with gardens, music therapy, staff trained in memory care. He said it gently, as if it were a kindness. I blinked, then gave a wan smile and said it might be nice to have someone else do the cooking. Then I asked him what day it was. He looked pleased. As he cleared our bowls, I sat quietly, looking out the window. The recorder had been running the whole time. Every word, every pause, every calculated kindness. After he left, I locked the door and went to the study. I took off my cardigan and set the recorder gently on the desk. My hand did not shake. In the silence, I replayed the moment in my mind. Not with rage, but with precision. Because now I had more than memory. I had proof, and the silence, once so unbearable, had become my greatest ally. The next morning, I found Leland's old number in a yellowed Rolodex tucked behind my cookbooks. I hadn't spoken to her in years. Not from any falling out, but because life, after Arthur died, had a way of contracting. We had worked together for 15 years at the university library. She was sharp, always a step ahead, and had a way of spotting a flaw in a plan before it had a chance to unravel. I called and left a message. My voice was calm, direct. I told her I needed a legal mind I could trust and that it was a personal matter. Within the hour, she texted me back. She would be at my house at 4 p.m. When she arrived, her presence filled the room without taking it over. She wore a navy wool coat and had her graying hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. She looked exactly the same, composed, unsentimental, with no time for false pleasantries. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured chamomile tea into my mismatched cups. I slid the audio recorder and a file folder across the table to her. No explanation, just the offering. She listened to the entire recording. Her expression never changed. When it finished, she looked at me and said, "We'll fix this." She opened her laptop. Her fingers, still nimble from decades of typing catalog cards, moved quickly. She asked about my current power of attorney and whether it had been updated since Arthur's death. I said, no. She nodded. The first thing we would do, she said, was revoke Grant's authority. Then we would draft a new will, designate a trustworthy executor, and notify the state of the changes. Everything would be documented and timestamped. She asked if I had any digital backups of my important documents. I said I did not. She told me we would fix that too. For the next hour, she laid out a plan. It was clean, quiet, and legal. Everything Grant had assumed I would forget, I was about to rewrite. Leland was precise but never cold. She wasn't surprised. She'd seen this before. Not necessarily with children, but with people who believed access meant ownership. We moved into the living room. She scanned copies of Arthur's annotated will. She helped me set up encrypted cloud storage. She even created a dedicated folder titled Dolores_legal_private. She explained how to update entries, where to store medical reports, and which versions to retain. Before she left, she placed a single piece of paper in front of me. It was a formal revocation of power of attorney. My name, his name, the date. I signed it. She slid the paper into her briefcase. Her last words were simple. This is the first step. After she left, I sat by the window, watching the bare branches of the dogwood tree sway in the wind. The house was quiet again. But this time, it was not an empty quiet. It was the sound of something solid being built back up. One decision at a time, one document at a time, one version of myself at a time. And I was no longer alone. The days that followed moved with a quiet precision. Leland had given me a checklist, but by the second morning, I no longer needed to read it. The rhythm of protecting myself had become ingrained, the kind of order I hadn't felt since my early years in the archives, when every document told its own story and my job was simply to preserve it. I started with my medical records. I made an appointment with Dr. Elkins, the same doctor I had seen for over a decade. During the visit, I requested a cognitive evaluation, not because I had any doubts, but because I wanted it in writing. Dr. Elkins didn't question me. He performed the assessment, checked my reflexes, reviewed my charts, and then handed me a signed letter, cognitively sound, no signs of impairment. I folded it carefully and tucked it into the expanding file I now carried in my purse. Back home, I gathered everything I could find that confirmed my lucidity: grocery receipts, bank statements with handwritten notes in the margins, printed out emails from the past 2 years. I made lists. I dated every page. I organized them into categories: legal, medical, personal. I labeled the folders just as I had once labeled historical collections: clearly, consistently, irrefutably. I scanned every page into my new cloud storage. Leland had walked me through it twice, and now I could do it with my eyes closed. I used a small, fast scanner she had lent me. Each file was saved with a timestamp. Each document was a small brick in the wall I was building between myself and the person Grant thought I had become. In the back of my closet, behind old winter coats and in a used suitcase, I found a box labeled Arthur, Letters. Inside were correspondences. Most were simple notes from their early years of marriage, full of mundane sweetness, grocery lists, quick reminders, little hearts drawn next to his name. But one letter stood out. It was a single, handwritten page on his personal letterhead, dated 10 years ago. There was no envelope, just the paper folded in fourths and tucked between two travel books. It read, "If our son ever makes you doubt yourself, Dolores, trust your gut. You have always seen more clearly than you give yourself credit for." I sat on the edge of the bed with the letter in my lap. The house was still. My heart beat steadily. The wind outside picked up, brushing against the window pane like fingertips. Arthur had known. Not the specifics, but the possibility. He had seen something in Grant I wasn't ready to see then. I was ready now. That night, I backed everything up again. I sent a copy of The Drive to Mlellan and placed a flash drive in my safe deposit box. I added one last note in my journal. There is no such thing as being overprepared when someone is trying to erase you. And I went to sleep without leaving the hall light on. For the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up to check the locks. I had done the work, and I was no longer on the defensive. I was documenting my own survival in my own handwriting in real time. He appeared on a Wednesday. I didn't hear the car pull in, but the doorbell chimed just after noon. I took a deep, steadying breath and went to the door without rushing. When I opened it, Grant stood there, holding a paper bag in one hand and a small, supermarket bouquet of tulips in the other. He smiled, that gentle expression he always wore after he'd been caught sneaking a snack before dinner. I stepped aside and let him in without a word. The tulips were yellow. I thanked him and put them in the old blue vase on the dining table. He remarked that the house was quiet and said it felt peaceful. I agreed. He unloaded the bag in the kitchen without asking. A carton of vegetable soup, a crusty baguette, a bar of dark chocolate. I offered to heat the soup, but he waved me away and did it himself. He moved through my kitchen as if he belonged there. He always had. We sat at the table. He asked how I'd been sleeping. I told him some nights were better than others. He nodded and asked if I'd given any more thought to having someone come by to check in once or twice a week. I said it might not be a bad idea. I let my spoon move a little too slowly in my soup bowl. My hand was less steady than usual. He watched me intently, the way one watches a clock they've just adjusted. Then he began to talk about the places he'd researched. Assisted living communities with wellness programs, walking paths, private rooms. He spoke gently, as if it were just a suggestion. He said I deserved a rest, that it wasn't safe to be alone so much. I looked down, running my finger along the edge of my placemat, and said I would look at the brochures. His face softened, with relief, perhaps. When he offered to take me to visit one of the places next week, I smiled again and said, maybe. Then I asked him to remind me what day it was. He told me, and I nodded as if I'd forgotten. I let the silence hang between us. He stayed for another half hour, walking through the halls as if checking for things I might have missed, pointing out a flickering bulb in the laundry room, mentioning that the porch railing felt loose. I filed away every observation. Before he left, he touched my shoulder lightly and said he only wanted what was best for me. I placed my hand over his and said I knew. The moment the door closed behind him, I went to the back window and watched him get into his car. He sat there for a moment, typing something into his phone. His mouth moved silently, as if in rehearsal. I turned away and went to the study. The small recorder on the bookshelf had been running since he arrived. Every sentence, every suggestion, every carefully chosen word was now archived. That night, I uploaded the file, naming it Visitation. Grant discusses assisted living. The performance had been nearly flawless, but so was the recording. The morning after Grant's visit, I rearranged the living room, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to make space under the side table for a second recording device. Placement was critical. He often paced near the window when he was agitated. I tested the angle. The range would ensure the microphone picked up any conversations on the porch as well. I left the front door unlocked again, a gesture of openness, of vulnerability. Then I moved slowly through the kitchen, deliberately placing small signals of absent-mindedness. I left the refrigerator door slightly ajar and put a measuring cup in the sink instead of the cupboard. When I passed the hall mirror, I fluffed my hair just enough to look like I hadn't noticed. At 10:40, his car was in the drive again. He came up the steps humming something under his breath. I met him on the porch, a wool cardigan pulled tight around my shoulders, and asked what brought him back. He said he was in the neighborhood, just checking in. He handed me a new brochure from the care facility he'd mentioned before. I took it with both hands, letting my fingers tremble slightly. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I sat on the porch swing and asked him what time it was. He smiled, answered gently, and sat beside me. I glanced down at the brochure and murmured that the pictures looked nice. He leaned in, describing the walking paths and the music room as if he were selling a vacation home. Then he mentioned paperwork, said he'd spoken to someone named Ashby, a legal advisor he trusted, that Ashby, could help file the necessary documents. He said he wanted things to be in order so there was no confusion if something were to happen. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes on the street. He stepped away to take a call. I heard his voice drift in through the open window. He spoke clearly, but not loudly. Ashby's name was mentioned again, along with phrases like expedited review and mental capacity. He mentioned next week. He said I was almost ready. I sat perfectly still, not stiff, not rigid, just silent. The porch microphone was catching every word. When he came back, he had a cup of tea for me. I thanked him, asking if we'd talked about this last time. He smiled as if proud of me for remembering. Then he asked if I wanted to visit the facility on Thursday. I said I would think about it. I took a sip of tea, let it sit on my tongue, and said the flavor reminded me of something Arthur used to make. He didn't reply, just nodded, and said he'd call me tomorrow. After he left, I went back inside and carefully disconnected the microphone from under the porch eave. I uploaded the new file to the storage folder and labeled it clearly. That night, Mlellan came over. She brought her tablet, and we moved everything onto 2 encrypted backups. I showed her the notes Grant had left in the care facility brochure. He had circled a line in the admission policy. Transfer of medical power of attorney contingent on observed need. She looked at me and then handed me a folder of her own. Inside was a sworn affidavit confirming my current legal and medical competence, signed by Dr. Elkins and 2 notaries. The game had changed. Grant believed he was closing in, but I was documenting his every move, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was preparing to be seen. 3 days after Grant's last visit, Mlellan sent a formal response to Ashby's office. The envelope was heavy with documents: the affidavit of mental competence, the new, notarized power of attorney, the updated will, and a written notice declaring all previous powers of attorney null and void. Everything was documented, time-stamped, and signed in duplicate. It was not a declaration of war. It was a shield. She didn't email it. She delivered it herself, a quiet visit to the downtown legal complex where Ashby's firm had offices on the 2nd floor, above a dental clinic. She left it with the receptionist, asking only that it be placed directly in his hands. Then she walked away. That evening, she called me. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite decipher. She said Ashby had called her directly not long after receiving the documents, not to argue, not even to defend his position. He said something strange, that he had reviewed everything carefully and that he would be withdrawing from the situation. Then, unprompted, he added that Arthur had once done him a favor at a time when few others would. It wasn't a confession, but it was enough to put a hairline fracture in the wall Grant had been building. I sat with that call replaying in my mind. I took out Arthur's handwritten note again, the one from the old box. I ran my thumb along the last line. The next day, I received a letter by courier. It was not from Grant. It was from Ashby, a short, typed message on company letterhead. He stated that he would no longer be involved in any legal matters concerning my estate. Attached was a log of all documents that had been filed on my behalf in the last 6 months, including those Grant had initiated. The paper trail was meticulous: dates, digital logs, proposed drafts, emails. I spent the afternoon reading every line. There were phrases I recognized from my conversations with Grant, sentences repeated verbatim. What he'd said to me over soup had appeared in a draft of a statement of concern attached to a conservatorship proposal. There were even template pages for future affidavits designed to be filled out by neighbors or friends regarding observed memory issues. He had been quietly building a case. And now I had his playbook. I called Mlellan. We agreed on the next step. She would prepare a brief statement of intent to be filed if there were any further legal moves from Grant's side. A warning, not a threat, that any attempt to override my authority would be treated as an act of legal overreach and elder coercion, that it would be documented. That night, I put the letter from Ashby next to Arthur's note in my bedside table drawer. 2 men, one who had tried to quietly erase me, and one who had left just enough light for me to find my way back. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, as if I had finally moved out of a state of waiting and into clean air. The silence in the house no longer pressed down on me. It stood beside me, strong and expectant. Grant arrived without warning. No call, no text, just the sound of tires crunching on the gravel and the slow creak of the front gate. I had been expecting this. The letter from Ashby had changed something, and I knew he wouldn't wait long to try to reassert control. I watched from the window as he walked up the path with a folder under his arm. His stride was even, but his shoulders were tense. The mask of concern was still there, but thinner now, stretched over something sharper. When I opened the door, I didn't greet him with surprise. I simply stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. He followed me to the kitchen, remarking on the smell of cinnamon. I had been warming mulled cider on the stove, a deliberate scent to fill the house. He didn't sit. He placed the folder on the table and remained standing, as if waiting for a cue. I poured 2 mugs. I handed one to him and sat down opposite him. The space between us was clear, almost ceremonial. He started gently, mentioning that Ashby had withdrawn unexpectedly and that it left things unclear. I nodded. He said he was concerned about some paperwork being changed without his knowledge. I took a sip of cider. Then I reached into the drawer beside me and took out a small stack of papers. They were clean copies, non-confrontational, just facts. The new power of attorney, the updated will, the statement from Dr. Elkins, the notarized affidavit of competence. I slid them across the table one by one. He didn't pick them up. He just stared. I looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, just with clarity. I said I had been making my own decisions, legal, responsible decisions. I said I knew exactly what I was doing and that pretending otherwise wouldn't change it. He didn't react. His jaw shifted once, a tiny movement. His eyes scanned the documents again, then flickered up toward the hallway. I wondered if he was looking for signs, proof that I had someone else here or that I was being coached. Then I said something simple, not all silence is weakness, Grant. He stood for another moment. Then he gathered the papers, placed them back on the table without folding them, and walked to the door. He didn't slam it. He didn't say another word. He left the way he came. After the sound of his engine faded, I went back to the table. I picked up the small recorder hidden beneath the napkin holder and stopped the recording. The file name was already in my head: Quiet Confrontation, Complete Clarity. That night, I did not dream of Grant's childhood or Arthur's voice or legal phrases echoing in court halls. I dreamed of a room full of order, of labeled boxes and clean ledgers, and a window open to fresh air. For the first time in years, my decisions were my own, and that was enough. The silence that had inhabited the house for weeks began to change, not with noise, but with presence. Llewellyn's daughter, Tessa, arrived just after noon on a bright Saturday. She brought a canvas duffel bag, a laptop case, and a way of moving through the halls so lightly it was as if she'd always belonged. She wasn't loud. She didn't ask too many questions. She set herself up in the small guest room with a quiet confidence, plugging in a hard drive, organizing textbooks, stacking binders beside the nightstand. Tessa was studying archival sciences, and she spoke in that same calm, measured tone that reminded me of my years at the university. By evening, the house felt different. She offered to make tea and stood in my kitchen as if it were her own. She hummed as she waited for the kettle to boil. It was nothing dramatic, just the melody of a folk song I hadn't heard in decades. The scent of verbena drifted lightly down the hall. That night, I heard the soft, steady tap of her typing from down the hall. Not fast, not frantic, just consistent. The sound reminded me of Arthur's old typewriter, the one he'd kept in the basement long after word processors had taken over. There was an anchor in it. Over the next few days, Tessa became part of the rhythm. She took out the recycling without being asked. She printed labels for some of my old photo albums. She asked if she could digitize the journals I'd kept during my years at the library. She treated everything with care, and she never tried to impress. She simply worked. I gave her the legal file on the third day, not the originals, but clean copies of everything: the medical affidavit, the POA, the revised will, and the audio recordings. She archived them on an encrypted drive, added backup protocols, and uploaded them to a secure, university-grade cloud. Grant called that night. I saw his name on the screen, but I let it ring. No message was left. Later, Tessa sat at the dining table with her laptop and asked if I wanted to label the boxes in the garage together the next morning. I said yes. It felt like saying yes to something larger than cardboard and tape. It felt like saying yes to movement, to a life beyond defense. The rooms no longer echoed when I walked through them. The kitchen had fingerprints on the counters again. The floors needed to be swept more often, and I loved it. I wrote in my journal that night, just a single sentence: the house is no longer quiet, and neither am I. The morning air had changed. The trees outside the window rustled with a quiet confidence, as if they knew something was over and something else had begun. I sat at my desk with my journal open, the same one I'd kept since Arthur passed. The pages were thick now, not just with words but with clarity. I thought of how far I had come, not in miles or countable achievements, but in the slow, deliberate walk back to myself. There was no screaming match, no final slamming of a door, just the quiet accumulation of small decisions stacked like stones on a path I had carved myself. I turned to the last page. The ink moved steadily as I wrote. Let him speak first, then watch him crumble. I closed the journal, placed it in the drawer beside Arthur's letter, and slipped the key into the pocket of my cardigan. The kitchen was warm. Tessa had left for class early, but her teacup was in the sink, the steam gone but the memory of it still there. I walked slowly through the house. My hand brushed along the walls. The pictures were straight. The runner near the front door had a crease where her backpack had been dropped one too many times. The light in the hall flickered once, then settled into its glow. Outside, the wind pushed gently against the glass. I stood at the window and watched the leaves turn over and over, gold on one side, a fading green on the other. There was no announcement, no audience. But I knew something had ended. Not my story, just the part where I waited for someone else to decide how it would go. And that was enough. If this story has stayed with you, perhaps it is because somewhere deep down, you have also felt that kind of silence, the kind that isn't weakness, but survival. If you have ever been overlooked, ignored, or made to doubt your own voice, I hope this has served as a small reminder that dignity does not require permission. You are not alone in your quiet strength, and you never were. If this has moved you, I would be grateful if you would share your thoughts, or simply carry this story with you for a little while longer.